Japan entered World War II with an expectation that it would be a short war. The Japanese leadership knew that they didn't have the infrastructure to compete with the United States' full industrial potential. With this view in mind, the Japanese tried to build the biggest fleet they could in the years leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese pilots had a clear edge in pilot skill and experience when the war broke out, but the Pacific War was characterized by a steady improvement in Allied pilot skills and a steady degradation for the Japanese. Before the war, the Japanese leadership valued quality over quantity for their pilots, both for the Imperial Japanese Navy and for the Imperial Japanese Army. Japan, like many nations, was very selective about their pilots. They purposely washed out the vast majority of their pilot candidates. To give an example of this, out of the 1,500 sailors who applied for the pilot training system in 1937, just 70 were accepted and 25 graduated. A year later, attitudes started shifting towards getting more pilots through the program. Even so, the Japanese pilot training system was so rigorous that only about 100 men a year graduated in a program that lasted at least 7 months. By the time it ended, candidates had logged a minimum of 254 to 400 hours of flight time. There was also another 3 to 5 months of operational training, adding at least another 300 hours on top of that. In 1940, it was proposed that the pilot training program be made shorter, less rigorous, and more productive in order to build up the pool of available pilots to 15,000. This was rejected. Tojo's government believed it needed the best pilots possible to win a short war. Naturally, once the war began, the Imperial Navy started losing pilots faster than they could be replaced. For example, the 29 pilots lost at Pearl Harbor represented more than a quarter of the annual crop. None of the Japanese pilots involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor had logged less than 600 hours of flying time. Flying the Excellent Zero, Japanese fighter pilots were able to sweep opposing aircraft out of the skies of the Pacific in the early months of the war. The battles of the next year would lead to the loss of hundreds of these superb pilots. There were no sizable pilot reserves on the Japanese side in late 1941. Almost all of their qualified pilots were either with the fleet or supporting the Army. Realizing that they faced a pilot shortage, the Japanese Air Force quickly inducted hundreds of young men into its ranks by giving them very basic pilot training. Even so, the training system proved entirely inadequate to replace combat losses. Though Japanese carrier pilots continued to show superb combat skill through the end of 1942, by mid-1943, Allied pilots began to notice a sharp decline in their opponents' flying skills. By the end of 1943, the Japanese Army and Navy had lost about 10,000 pilots. As American Lieutenant General George C. Kenney reported to Washington, Japan's originally highly trained crews were superb, but they are dead. The Japanese academies produced about 5,400 Army and 5,000 Navy pilots in the same period, but when one considers the expansion in units, missions, tempo, geographical separation, it's clear that Japan's pilot strength had not increased at all. Worse, the vast majority of pre-war and even 1942 to 1943 veterans were dead or wounded, and their replacements had none of the veterans' experience. In 1941, a Japanese pilot trainee had to have 700 hours of flight time to qualify as a full-fledged pilot in the Imperial Navy. Japanese Army pilots averaged 500 hours of flight time. American naval pilots needed only 305 hours. At the beginning of the war, nearly 3/4 of the U.S. Navy's pilots had fewer flying hours than did the least qualified of the Japanese Navy's pilots. The ongoing combat losses finally forced the Japanese to reform their pilot training programs. The time to train a pilot and the hours in the air spiraled downward. By January 1, 1945, this had dropped to 275 hours in the Navy and 130 hours in the Army, and they were being certified fit for combat duty with less than 4 months of training, while his American opponent had at least 525 hours of flight time. Veteran Japanese instructors, including those on permanent limited duty and recovering from wounds, began to leave their training duties to rejoin combat units. Many frontline pilots hated teaching anyway, especially as the number of training hours dropped and the quality of students declined. Men who had been rejected for pilot training over the previous 2 years were suddenly now accepted. In the last 8 months of the war, a severe fuel shortage limited Japanese trainee pilots' flight time to only 90 hours before entering combat. In the air, this produced lopsided American victories, with 10 or more Japanese aircraft being lost for each U.S. one. The difference in the pilots' training programs caused Japan to lose over 500 planes for only 30 American planes in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The aerial part of the battle was nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American aviators because of the severe disproportional loss ratio inflicted upon Japanese aircraft by American pilots and anti-aircraft gunners. Japanese pilots had gotten so bad that the U.S. Navy lost just 2 dive bombers and 5 torpedo planes in aerial combat in the last 8 months of the war. The Japanese military, which had hidden the extent of the previous losses from the Japanese public, continued this policy. Though the occurrence of the simultaneous Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Saipan were made known to the public, the extent of the disasters was withheld. Some supplementary facts are in 2 of my videos, the most excellent, Fight to the Death, the story of the 109th Japanese Division at Iwo Jima, parts 1 and 2, and also my other video, Island Hopping, which gives facts about how the Allies were able to take control of the Pacific so quickly. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. If you liked what you see, hit the subscribe button or share. Thank you. This has been EmersusTech.